Thanks very much to all of you for being with us this morning. We know more will be joining us, but I'll go ahead with some introductory remarks to protect time for our speaker, whom we're very much looking forward to hearing from. I want to welcome you all to the April Gathering of the Faith in the City series at Knollwood Baptist Church. We've been doing this now since the fall of 2018, convening community conversations, and we've stuck with one topic, the vital topic of educational equity, meeting monthly through the fall and the spring. My name's Diane Lipset, and I'm a member of the planning team together with Dean Clifford, Sylvia Oberly, and Spence O'Neill. So a few simple logistics. Please stay muted during the presentation. You're welcome to use the chat to express questions and comments and type those in as they occur to you if you wish. We've asked our guest speaker to wait for the question period at the end so that we can raise and address as many of those questions as possible then. As you watch the chat, if you do, you'll also see links for the Faith in the City Facebook page and our email address, so you can let us know if you'd like regular notification of programs. By any measure, Dr. Anthony Graham is one of our city and state's distinguished educational leaders. Currently the Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at Winston-Salem State University. Dr. Graham previously served as Professor and Dean of Education, and before his work in higher education was a high school English teacher. As a well-published and active scholar, Dr. Graham leverages critical race theory to examine the academic experiences of African-American male students and how their academic and ethnic identities are formed in their educational environments. A little bit of background. In December 2019, Governor Roy Cooper tapped Dr. Graham to chair a statewide task force with 34 members on developing a representative and inclusive vision for education, the acronym DRIVE. That group was charged in part with addressing the widening gap between the percentage of students of color in the state and the diversity of the educator workforce. A year later, that task force completed its work. 1 year ago, Dr. Graham was our guest in the Faith in the City series with a presentation on the task force, and his informative and challenging and moving address made clear the meaning of motivational speaker, I think. Today, Dr. Graham's goal is to provide an update on the work of the task force and share recent movement in North Carolina related to that work. He's titled the presentation, Still Driving to Achieve Equity and Inclusivity in North Carolina's K-12 public schools. Dr. Graham, we welcome you warmly. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Dr. Lipset, so very much for the invitation to circle back, and I am honored to join you this morning. I am going to dive right into the conversation because there's a lot here that I want to share with you. And as I unpack it, you'll see that not only has there been a lot of activity relative to what we're doing with the Drive Task Force, but there have been concurrent activity as well occurring. And I want to make certain that I bring you up to speed on those pieces because it's something I want to make certain that we as a community are aware that's occurring around us. So let me dive into the conversation here. And what I want to do as I talk about still driving, this notion of making certain that we continue to lean into equity and inclusivity in what we do in our public schools. What I want to do is essentially look back. I was fortunate enough to join you all last year around the same time of the year, but I don't want to do any assumptive teaching, as we say in our educator preparation programs. I don't want to assume that you remember what I talked about last year, nor do I want to assume that you were even with us last year. So I'm going to pull in some of the information just as context. Dr. Lipset did a great job alluding to some pieces of it. And I want to make certain that I delve a little bit more. Then I want to look at where we are presently and then where we're going futuristically in terms of resulting drive task force actions that are occurring around us. So let me look back very quickly and make certain that we're all on the same page. So when we began our work as a task force 2 years now ago, we were very concerned and continue to remain concerned about the incongruence between the racial ethnic demography of our K-12 classroom teachers compared to the K-12 student demography. So, and what happens in the state of North Carolina is consistent, unfortunately, with what we see across the nation, where the majority of our classroom teachers are Caucasian, but the preponderance of our students is increasingly diverse in terms of race and ethnicity. And it's not just with our classroom teachers. We also see it with our administrators, we see it with our teacher assistants, and we see it with our school counselors. So it is safe to say in the state of North Carolina that the majority of our K-12 educators, those licensed individuals in the school, are primarily Caucasian, whereas our student population is increasingly students of color. Additionally, what we know is in terms of K-12 classroom educators, the racial demography is essentially consistent with what you see at the K-12 classroom teacher level. So the majority of our candidates in our educator preparation programs back in 2018 were white students. And when we look at our alternative preparation pathway, the majority of those students are white as well. Now, you see more racial ethnic diversity in the alternative preparation pathway than you do with the traditional pathway. But regardless of pathway, the majority of the candidates moving through our programs are Caucasian students. The reason this is of concern is we have research that spans about a decade now, maybe a little bit more, that shows us very explicitly that teachers of color have positive impact on K-12 student learning. It used to be 20 years ago that, or 30 years ago, that our research indicated that teachers of color had impact on students of color only, but it had little to do with their academic performance and more to do with their motivation, more to do with their post-secondary aspirations, those types of things. Now we have conclusive research that shows that it goes beyond just motivation and aspirations, but it also has direct impact on their academic performance as well. So we see teachers of color moving the needle in very significant ways on reading scores, on math scores, on science scores for all students, not just students of color. And a lot of this is attributed to what we're finding in the research literature, that our teachers of color are more than likely and will use more frequently what we call culturally relevant pedagogy in the classroom, which is an effort or a practice that affirms students' identities, their racial ethnic identities, their gender identities, and so forth. And it's a practice that ensures that students are engaged in the content of the information that's presented, but they're also connecting what they're learning in terms of discipline knowledge with how to leverage it in the community. So it really is this bridge building approach to teaching students, if you will, which we believe is the application of how you learn the content knowledge that really drives the learning, if you will, which is why we believe we're seeing the positive impact on their academic performance outcomes. Now, having said that, we're also still seeing that our teachers of color have positive impacts on students' desires to pursue post-secondary opportunities, four-year institutions, two-year institutions, and we see that Black students specifically are less likely to drop out when they're taught by at least one Black teacher. Of concern, though, is the mass exodus of teachers of color. So these teachers of color have impact on student learning, they have impact on student motivation, impact on student aspiration post-secondary, but we're seeing a lot of our teachers of color leave the classroom at a clip of almost 24% higher than their white counterparts. And when asked, why are you leaving the classroom, these teachers of color tend to say unequivocally that I feel devalued, I feel silenced, I'm often questioned in the classroom in terms of what I'm doing pedagogically, and I'm questioned outside the classroom in terms of my professional approach. So unfortunately, we're having difficulty recruiting teachers of color, and we're having difficulty retaining teachers of color, which then leads directly to why Governor Cooper decided to commission the Drive Task Force back in December 9th, 2019, via Executive Order number 113. This 34-member task force, working in partnership with the Hunt Institute, is charged with advising Governor Cooper on issues and matters relative to equity and inclusion in our K-12 public schools. The 34 members of this task force represent a wide variety of areas and sectors. We have individuals from our K-12 public schools. We have individuals from public and private institutions of higher education, representatives from the Department of Health and Human Services. We have individuals from the business sector. We have representatives. We have senators. We have individuals from the State Board of Education. So it is a very robust membership for the Drive Task Force. And what Governor Cooper asked us to do was to submit to him a plan by January 1 of 2021 that achieved 5 things. Number one, we were to assess the state's progress toward increasing K-12 public school teacher diversity. We were to identify short, mid, and long-term strategies to increase educator diversity. We were asked to identify assets that would aid with recruiting, retaining, and supporting educators of color, propose metrics and standards to evaluate success, and then to prioritize all this information in terms of recommendations that would lead to increasing educator diversity. So based on that work, the task force engaged in a year-long, almost 8 months worth of work during a pandemic. We did a lot of work virtually. And to this day, I've not met some of these people in person. We will have our very first in-person meeting in the next 3 weeks. So it will be my first opportunity to meet the task force members in person. So we've been working virtually for over a year now, almost 2 years. But we grouped our work into the recruitment of candidates and teachers of color, the preparation of candidates of color via traditional and alternative pathways, and then the ways we go about supporting and retaining teachers of color. So based on the work and the analysis, and there was a lot of work, a lot of data excavation, a lot of analysis, but we ended up submitting to Governor Cooper a report that outlined 10 recommendations and 46 strategies. So 3 recommendations focused on recruitment and what we could do and should do with respect to recruiting more people of color into our educator preparation programs. 3 recommendations that focus specifically on how we go about preparing all candidates in our educator preparation programs, but specifically our candidates of color. And then 3 recommendations that focused on how we go about ensuring that we're supporting our teachers of color so that we can retain them in our public schools. And then 1 global recommendation that spoke to ways in which we can ensure that this work would sustain over time. And then these 46 strategies, short-term, midterm, long-term, align with these different recommendations. So that's the report that we submitted to Governor Cooper. When I was with you last time, I kind of walked through some of the recommendations. What I want to do today is update you and share with you where we are with respect to some of the resulting actions that have emerged as a result of the task force report, but also update you on some other tangential conversations that are occurring that I want you to be aware of. So let me share with you action number 1. Very recently, Governor Cooper signed into law Executive Order number 243. This extends the initial Executive Order 113 that established the Drive Task Force. Initially, the task force was put in place, and we were to conclude our work by December 31st of 2021. The majority of the task force members felt that this work was so important and so pressing that we didn't want to leave it. So we asked the governor to consider extending the task force for another 2 years, and he agreed to do so. So the Drive Task Force has been extended through December 31st of 2023. It allows us to reconstitute the membership slightly. As you can imagine, over time, people have changed jobs and so forth. So we are in the process of reconstituting some of the membership of the task force, but we will still end up with a task force that will be about 25 to 29 people thereabout. And it will continue to be inclusive and representative of individuals across the state of North Carolina. In this executive order, we've also been charged with creating an action plan or a sustainability plan, understanding that perhaps this task force will not be renewed after 2023, but we want to make certain that there's an action plan that will carry this work forward for the next 7 to 10 years. And we've also been asked to submit an annual progress report that illustrates the impact of the recommendations and strategies that we articulated in the task force report. So in an interesting way, we asked for additional work and the governor said, no problem, we will give you additional work. And we are pleased to have that additional work. So connected to this executive order number 243 is the sustainability plan. We are in progress of creating this multi-year action plan where we're taking those 10 recommendations and those 46 strategies, and we're prioritizing them and essentially developing an action plan in a phased approach. So what are the things that need to occur in the first 3 years, the foundational years, if you will, to ensure that the work of the task force will sustain over time? And then what will need to occur in years 4, 5, and 6 in the intermediate years? And then what will need to occur long-term, years 7 through 10. So we are making certain that this work and the recommendations of the task force will live beyond the life of the task force, irrespective of when this task force will eventually conclude, whether it's 2023 or some other point in the future. So that sustainability plan is critically important, and we will be presenting this sustainability plan at our next Drive Task Force meeting coming up in the next couple of weeks here of April 22. So more to come on that. The other thing that we're working on is a Drive Summit 2.0. Back in December of 2019, the inaugural Drive Summit was launched and it was hosted at North Carolina State University. And at that point in time, the Drive Task Force was presented publicly by Governor Cooper. Well, we are wanting to take that Drive Summit and have a 2.0. So we have planned the Drive Summit for Friday, June 17th, and it will be at North Carolina A&T State University. We intentionally wanted to ensure that the summit would be hosted this year at one of our historically Black colleges and universities. Part of what we in the report really emphasized was centering the experiences and the resources of our historically Black colleges and universities. So we didn't want to, in the report, make that a recommendation, if you will, but then in our actions, we not reinforce that. So we will have the Drive Summit at North Carolina A&T. It will build on the summit from December of 2019, and we will publicly unveil the action plan. We'll also work very strategically to foster collaborations between our public school partners and our community partners and our business sector and our higher education community, nonprofits, faith-based, and so forth. So we're excited about continuing this Drive Summit this summer. The next action that I want to share with you are specific legislative and budgetary implementation items, and very pleased of many of these pieces. First, part of what we wanted in the Drive Task Force was to see the Teaching Fellows program expanded. Back in 2018, I think it was, the Teaching Fellows program made its return. 5 universities were selected to implement the Teaching Fellows program, but all of those institutions were our majority institutions. No HBCU or minority serving institution was selected for the Teaching Fellows program. So very recently, as a result of the Drive Task Force report and some advocacy and things of that nature, the Teaching Fellows program has been expanded to UNC Pembroke, North Carolina A&T State University, and Fayetteville State University. I tried to get it here at Winston-Salem State University, but unfortunately I was not successful, but I will make certain on the next round WSSU is one of the institutions that has a teaching fellows program. Nevertheless, I am pleased to say that we have 3 minority serving institutions with the teaching fellows program housed on their campuses. Also, as a result of the conversation with the Drive Task Force, the Department of Public Instruction launched the Office of Equity and Inclusion. So that is a new office that focuses very myopically on what occurs in this space of equity and inclusion. This is a good thing from my vantage point, because as I think about the recommendations of the Drive Task Force and where this work may live post task force, I believe the Office of Equity with DPI is a prime candidate to take this work and sustain it moving forward. So very pleased to see this Office of Equity up and running now at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. Also, in House Bill 555, which is essentially the governor's budget, the governor introduced 2 pieces that are directly connected to the Drive Task Force report. First is the Drive Grant Program. Very pleased to see this Drive Grant Program. It essentially is a program that provides funds for local school administrative units or our local educational agencies, our institutions of higher education, and community organizations to implement innovative initiatives that support the recruitment, preparation, support, and retention of racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse educators. So it is an opportunity for school districts, institutions of higher education, community organizations to work in concert with one another to increase teacher diversity. So it could be things like grow your own programs within the community. It could be strengthening existing dual enrollment programs. It could be campus-based recruitment programs for aspiring educators of color, so on and so forth. It allows these entities to work in partnership with one another to come up with innovative ways to increase teacher diversity in our school districts. So very pleased to see this Drive Grant Program with funding available to support it. Secondly, within the governor's budget, teacher residency pilot programs that support our local educational agencies. So part of our report in the Drive Task Force report, we really leaned in on one of the recommendations with respect to scaling the teacher residency programs that we see across the state of North Carolina. There's a great deal of research on teacher residency programs nationally, and we're learning that these teacher residency models have a significant impact on the retention of classroom teachers. They're staying beyond 5 years, and those teacher residencies or those teacher residents have direct impact on K-12 student learning. We're seeing significant growth when it comes to the students whom these residents teach. So if that's the case, then we need to invest a great deal more of our money and energy and resources in developing teacher resident models across the state of North Carolina. But these are very costly endeavors. Before I left North Carolina A&T, I wrote a grant with my colleagues there for $6 million from the Department of Education to launch a teacher residency program. And we were fortunate to receive funding. And that program is still up and running, but it only produces 100 teachers. So you're talking about $6 million to produce 100 teachers. But our belief is, and I believe it will bear true, those 100 individuals who are produced will remain in the classroom beyond 5 years. So while it's a significant monetary investment on the front, it will, I believe, pay off on the back end because those individuals will remain in the classroom, and I believe they'll have significant impact on student learning. And beyond that, the task force report, the Drive Task Force report, has led to some broader conversation and action. And I wanted to spend just a few minutes today sharing with you all some of that broader conversation that's tangential to the Drive Task Force, but is directly connected to the work of the Drive Task Force, if you will. So if you're not familiar with the North Carolina Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission, what we call PEPSI, then I would like to spend just a few minutes familiarizing you with the PEPSI Commission and what PEPSI does. The PEPSI Commission was created on September 1, 2017, as part of Senate Bill 599. That Senate bill had a number of reforms for our educator preparation programs. And part of that was creating this commission that would be comprised of 18 people, 9 people from our K-12 public schools and 9 people from our institutions of higher education. And this group, this commission, would then serve as an advisory board to the North Carolina State Board of Education. This group is responsible for influencing policies, influencing regulations regarding preparation, licensure, excuse me, continuing education, and standards of conduct policies for our K-12 classroom educators. So this is a body that serves in an advisory capacity to the State Board of Education. I'm fortunate to serve on Pepsi. I've been on Pepsi since its inception, and Pepsi has done a lot of great work. But where I want to zero our conversation today is the work that we're doing with respect to the Human Capital Roundtable. When the Drive Task Force began its work, there was a concurrent conversation with members of Pepsi, with members of the State Board of Education, with members from the UNC system, members from the North Carolina Independent Colleges and Universities, that engaged in a conversation relative to how can we, as a state, begin to think differently about our teacher professionals and the ways in which we are creating an early, inclusive, clear passageway into the teaching profession that rewards excellence and advancement and encourages retention. Essentially, the Human Capital Roundtable was responding to or attempting to respond to our current licensure policy, which you see before you on the screen, where it's a very narrow entrance. There's only one way into becoming a classroom teacher, and then there's a very narrow way out, if you will. And effectiveness is not considered in that pathway. So it's very unclear in terms of how an ineffective teacher might exit the classroom. It's very unclear if there are extended opportunities to stay in the system. So the Human Capital Roundtable wanted to come up with a model that would allow for a larger entryway, if you will, but then multiple exit ramps for individuals who are ineffective in the classroom, while also rewarding those individuals who are demonstrating effectiveness in the classroom. So the Human Capital Roundtable created what's called the North Carolina Pathways to Excellence for Teaching Professionals. Pepsi, the Pepsi Commission, chaired by Superintendent Patrick Miller, Dr. Patrick Miller, took this work up and asked the Pepsi Commission to lead the work in trying to frame out what this new North Carolina Pathways to Excellence for Teaching Professionals framework would be. So we organized our Pepsi leadership members into 4 different areas. Preparation and entry is one area. Licensure is the second area. Advancement and development is the third area. And budget and compensation is the fourth area. Each group is chaired or co-chaired by a university representative and someone from the K-12 public school sector. I have the honor, along with Dr. Aaron Fleming, who's the superintendent of Harnett County Schools, to chair the Budget and Compensation Subcommittee, which is no small undertaking in and of itself. I'll talk more about that in just a second. What I'm going to share with you, though, is the North Carolina Pathways to Excellence for Teaching Professionals framework. Before I do, though, I want to make it explicitly clear that what I'm sharing with you is not the final model. This is where we stand to date. We are receiving input and feedback from the larger community. And now as subcommittees, we'll revisit the work that we're doing and begin to sharpen this model even more. But essentially, this model has 4 license levels and an apprentice teacher level. So it's split into essentially 2 areas. There's the entry level certifications, and then there's the professional level certification and advanced credentials. At the entry level, thinking back to, I'm going to skip back just a couple of screens here. thinking back to this model where we're trying to make certain that we're thinking about multiple ways to enter the profession, this framework allows multiple ways to enter the profession through the entry level certifications. So an apprentice teacher would not be a teacher of record, but could be someone who might be, for example, a teaching assistant or someone of that nature, an individual who holds an associate degree or equivalent coursework who is now working alongside an advanced teacher, if you will, so that they're learning about the profession, hopefully with the aspiration of becoming a license 3 teacher, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Then there's the license 1, the teacher in residency. This person would hold a bachelor's degree or have industry certification and experience, again, paired with an advanced teacher mentor. The goal is to get this person to become at least a license 4 expert teacher. At license 2, this is a teacher in residency individual. This person demonstrates basic foundational level knowledge in terms of content and pedagogy, again, paired with an advanced teacher. The goal is to get this person to become a licensed teacher or license 4. And then license 3 is a teacher in residency skills advancement. These would be individuals who are graduating from our educator preparation programs, whether it's a traditional pathway at the undergraduate level or through a residency program, i.e. alternative certification, but they would be entering as license 3. And then at the license 4, that's your expert teacher. And a license 4 teacher then could be eligible to become go into an advanced teacher role, either as classroom excellence or at the adult leadership area. I'm not going to get into all the nuances of the models, but what I want to share with you is the idea is that there are multiple entryways into the profession, and the goal is to get individuals moving up the ladder, if you will, to become a license 4 expert teacher. The other thing that I'll call your attention to is at the bottom of this framework. And again, this is not the final model. These are all proposals at this point. But I want you to see the salary schedule, the compensation schedule. It's different from the current salary or compensation schedule that we've had in the state of North Carolina for well over 30 years. I will call your attention to the license 3, the EPP area. At present, a candidate who graduates from an educator preparation program with an initial license will earn a minimum of $35,000, and then whatever the local supplement might be, depending on where he or she's hired. In this framework, we're increasing or proposing to increase that salary to $45,000. So a $10,000 increase plus whatever the local supplement may be. So from that starting point, if you will, now you can kind of work your way down these other license levels to see what the compensation might be if you're an apprentice teacher, a teacher in residency, or a teacher in residency at skills development. And then what it could be if you become a license 4 teacher, an expert teacher, and the additional compensation that might be available if you step into an advanced teacher role, whether in the classroom excellence space or the adult leadership space. So part of what we're doing here is trying to increase teacher pay, increase the compensation for our professional educators in our K-12 classrooms, which is directly connected to what we are advocating for in the Drive Task Force report. We believe doing so will assist with recruitment. We believe doing so will assist with retention. And we believe doing so, if we do it in the way in which we envision, can also assist with support and the preparation of our K-12 teachers. So I wanted to share this model with you at a very high level, just to let you know what's occurring around you, if you will. So as you start having these conversations with legislators and representatives and so forth, you can start having more discussions about what it means to increase teacher pay and how such a model or framework can assist with doing so. Because oftentimes what we've heard over the last 10, 15 years is, if there's conversation around teacher pay, then generally, where's the model? What is it that we can propose to help move that conversation along. And to date, we really haven't had a concrete model to put in front of our General Assembly. We're working now on such a model. And our expectation would be, if approved by the Board of Education, this would go to the General Assembly, and we would hope that they would find the dollars to support this particular framework. So that's where we are. I'm going to stop there. I went a little bit longer than I intended, but I wanted to make certain that I updated you on what we're doing with the Drive Task Force, but also updated you on what we're doing tangentially with the Pepsi Commission and trying to bring to fruition the vision of the Human Capital Roundtable. So I'll be quiet at this point, and I will entertain any questions or comments that you may have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Graham. And I'll just say a note to those who are in attendance, the recording that will be posted today or tomorrow of Dr. Graham's presentation will, of course, capture the slides. So much information there, much of which we really want to hang on to. Dr. Graham, I'm going to voice a couple of the questions that have been asked in the chat. Others may feel free to type their questions there, or we'll open for verbal questions shortly. From Suzanne Miller, a statewide advocate for education. First, where can we sign up to get more information on the June 17th summit? And is it open to anyone to attend?
No, great question. There'll be more information coming out in the next couple of weeks on the summit. I think the attendance will be capped, I believe, at 270 people is the number that I think I recall seeing. So it will be open, but we're going to try to manage the attendance just because of capacity and so forth. I will share with you, though, we're attempting to make certain that there's a virtual component to it as well. We realize that not everyone may be able to make it to Greensboro, North Carolina on a Friday, midsummer. So we want to make certain that it's available to others as best we can. So more to come on that.
Did those budget items that you named that were part of HB 555 make it into the final budget passed by the North Carolina General Assembly?
They did.
That's good news. And in your overview of these recommendations for pathways to licensure and compensation, what's being used to determine level 4, license for effective teaching, as mentioned on your slide?
Yeah, at present, it's primarily EVOS data. And I'm certain if you've been keeping up with this, you've seen some of the pushback that's resulting from this conversation. As a matter of fact, I read an article, I think it was yesterday, in Forbes magazine that criticized this approach and said that, if EVOS data is the singular metric that we're going to use, then North Carolina is going in the wrong direction. That's why I want to make certain that you all are aware, and as we share this with the larger public, this is where we are to date. It doesn't mean that's going to be the final metric or anything of that nature. It could be a host of other variables that play into the conversation to determine effectiveness. So that's where we are. We're still having those conversations. We're still thinking through what are the measures that make sense to truly assess teacher effectiveness, and how can we make certain that those metrics are fair, if you will, and are indicative of what it means to impact student learning. This is a larger philosophical question that we've been debating and struggling with in education for over 20 or 30 years. What does it mean to be an effective teacher, and how does one know? What are those measures? So we're tackling that as best we can right now. And, the truth of the situation is this won't be pretty. We're going to run into some speed bumps, and we're going to hit some potholes and those types of things. But our goal is to try to elevate and push forward the conversation, as opposed to getting stuck in the mud and not allowing ourselves to advance and evolve. So we're going to lean forward, and we realize it won't be perfect out the gate, but we've got to establish something to start a new baseline, if you will, and then study that and evolve. So, but we want to make certain that we do the best we can to develop a model that is fair and establishes a solid baseline and does not hurt or harm in the process.
Thank you. And thank you, Suzanne Miller, for putting the link to that Forbes article in the chat as well. I wonder what other questions our participants have that they would like to voice or to put in the chat. Other questions coming to mind? From Dean Clifford, Dr. Graham, what response have you seen thus far to your recommendations by both or either the State Board of Education and or from legislators?
Yeah, it's a great question. Dr. Miller and Dr. Tomberlin, who's with the Department of Public Instruction, presented an overview similar to what I did here moments ago, but they went a little bit in a little bit more detail to the State Board of Education about 2 months ago, I think it was. And the response was favorable in the sense we like what we're seeing, continue to work. And I will tell you from some of the legislators with whom I've had conversations, they're wanting us to lean into what we're doing and to be innovative, to think differently. So what you see with this pathways framework is a complete deviation from the existing compensation framework that we have in place. And we realize that that's going to make a lot of people uneasy. I was paid on that framework when I was teaching back in the late 90s. So that framework has been in place for a long time. So we know there's going to be a lot of trepidation. There's going to be some consternation. There's going to be some nervousness around what we're doing and a lot of anxiety, and rightfully so. But we want to make certain that we're talking about this and engaging audiences so individuals know what's going into it. This is not being done haphazardly. There's a lot of analysis that's occurring behind the scene and a lot of great conversation, but we are being encouraged to continue to lean into this direction as opposed to receiving pushback necessarily at this point. Now, obviously, there's mixed reaction to what people have seen thus far, but I haven't heard anyone say, stop what you're doing. We want to stick with the current framework. What I've heard is, that's not quite what we want, but keep working. And I can live with that's not quite what we want, keep working. It lets me know there's an appetite for change. So now we have to make certain that we're developing a model that's as fair and inclusive as possible.
Going a little bit out of order from how things are appearing in the chat, but I think Chuck Spong's question picked up on phrasing of your immediate response here. Chuck asks, is your hearing, we like what you're doing response bipartisan in nature, or are you having to invest an inordinate amount of time and energy to navigate political divides?
Well, yeah, that's a given. Anytime you start talking about compensation and impact on, salary implications and those types of things, you're going to navigate those political divides. But what I will say is, by and large, what I'm hearing on both sides of the aisle is that there's interest here. There's from my vantage point, a genuine desire to see us elevate the compensation and salary of our classroom teachers and to think about ways in which we can recruit and retain them at a higher clip. So there is genuine interest there. Now, as is always the case, the question becomes, how do you get there? And that's where the massaging of the political divides and the conversations and those types of things become a part of the work that we have to do, not only as a subcommittee in the Pepsi Commission, but also Superintendent Truitt at Department of Public Instruction and the State Board of Education and so on and so forth. So, but yeah, anytime you start stepping into this space, you're going to have to manage and massage those political divides. It's a natural given with the political nature.
And a directly relevant question to that from Dean Clifford, in the space of navigating political divides, are ways that critical race theory has been controversial or characterized or represented or misrepresented. Does that become a factor for the work and the goals of the DRIVE task force?
That's a great question. To date, no, we have not had any issues of which I'm aware of individuals saying critical race theory is somehow embedded in the work of the DRIVE task force. That doesn't mean it's not out there. I just have not heard it or received it myself. So at present, that has not been an issue, and I'm hoping it won't become an issue.
I don't want to miss that Chuck Spong has responded that there's a kind of wisdom and graciousness in how you're speaking about the political divide and how one navigates it. And we do
Well, I
want
appreciate it.
to note that. Again, from Suzanne Miller, until we address pre-K discrepancies and poverty, are there problems with holding teachers accountable for effective teaching? If students aren't starting at the same place, how does that affect evaluations of teacher effectiveness and special education funding and support here also, that then makes one wonder about how one evaluates teacher effectiveness when there are inequities in resources? How would you speak to that very complex and important cluster of issues?
No, it's a great question. And therein lies part of the challenge when you start talking about teacher effectiveness and why we have not come up with a uniform definition of teacher effectiveness across the United States of America, because there are inequities inherent in our educational system. The way that we fund school districts is based on your tax base. So if you're in, Pine Tops, North Carolina, your tax base is completely different from Charlotte, Mecklenburg County. The schools are funded though based on that inequitable structure. So when you start talking about teacher effectiveness, and we know that there's a correlation between socioeconomic status and student learning, then how does all that factor into teacher effectiveness? Therein lies the complexity and the nuance of defining teacher effectiveness. And unfortunately, I don't have a way to answer that specific question because it is something that we've been struggling with for 30 years or longer. And I don't know what the answer is, but I do know we have to lean into a direction to try to figure out a possible solution to said problem. And again, I always tell people I'm not naive or stupid. I will not sit here and tell you that this framework is going to solve all the problems. No, it could exacerbate it, who knows? But that is the nature of experimentation. And I think on the one hand, we can't say that we want to see an increase in teacher pay. And then on the other hand, say, well, there's a framework that's attempting to advocate for teacher pay, but we don't want to go in that direction. Let's stay status quo. It's that old phrase, everybody wants change as long as the change doesn't impact me. Um, so we've got to think about what we're doing here and, lean into a direction and see what we come up with, as is the nature of experimentation, and then learn from it. But it's a great question, and I wish I had an explicit answer to it. But you're absolutely right. Until we address issues of inequities, which is a much larger societal issue, because now you're talking about poverty. And how do we address poverty in society? Well, we've got to start there in order to get to these other micro level issues. But that's unfortunately something that we can't wait for. We have to act in spite of the macro level poverty and other types of things.
So to the question of proposals for increasing teacher compensation and increasing diversity, obviously central to your work,
Yes.
how does the Pepsi framework work with or against the Leandro plan? And I will say many members, many participants in Faith in the City are familiar with Leandro, and some may not be, but I'm also trusting our participants to be putting links in the chat to help others who might not be familiar. So, Dr. Graham.
It's a great question. In many ways, this framework is, as I said earlier, it's an experiment. And I hate to say it the way, but that's what it is, because we're operating under the hypothesis that if you increase teacher pay, if you increase supports, if you increase the things that would allow for continuing teachers to remain in the profession, it will then serve as a carrot, if you will, to attract new individuals into the profession. And we would hope, with the multiple pathways into the profession, more diverse teachers into the profession. So if we're getting more diverse teachers into the profession and we're retaining them, then that directly connects to our Drive Task Force report. The other piece that's inherent here, and it's based on the effectiveness concept, is that these individuals are high quality teachers. So we're getting new high quality teachers into the profession. We're retaining high quality teachers in the profession, and individuals who aren't having positive impact on student learning are exiting out of the profession. So now we're ensuring that we're getting high quality teachers to all students across the state of North Carolina, which is what the Leandro Plan calls for. So it is hypothesized that these things will occur. That's the ideal implementation. Now, as is the nature of experimentation, we won't know until we implement it.
You mentioned in your presentation that there's good data, not good data, reliable data that shows teachers of color leave the profession 24% more than other teachers year by year. So what does that look like with the exacerbated departures that have taken place during the pandemic?
That's a great question. We actually talked about this 3 weeks ago during our Pepsi meeting. Dr. Tomlin presented some data that was somewhat surprising for me, I suppose, not just me, but I think other commission members. We have seen in the state of North Carolina that the Great Resignation has not yet impacted our K-12 public school classrooms. The exit of teachers in our state is status quo with previous years. We've not seen any significant spikes. So, so far, so good. And we're hoping that remains the case.
That's interesting. Different from other reports that we've heard. So interesting to think about that. Are there other, where's that data from? Who funded it?
It's from Dr. Tom Tomberlin at the Department of Public Instruction. So that it's their data set on individuals who are in the classrooms.
Interesting. Yeah. Other questions from our participants? Comments, and you may use the chat or voice comments about what today. Chuck?
All right, so can I redirect then for a second? I like Dean, picked up on the CRT craziness, like we all are very well aware. And I think you expressed, we've been able to avoid that controversy, and yet you embrace it in the work that you do. So can you help us with some good language around, in essence, the defense of CRT versus this kind of let's avoid it at all possible costs, which I know that's not at all what you're saying.
Sure.
But to date in Forsyth County, it's rumbling around under the surface. We all kind of anticipate with the school board elections that we have here locally that it's going to, I mean, you're in the community, so you're well aware of all that. So can you kind of redeem, we're some of us spend time with Dr. Nash, Willette Nash, and so she's schooling us pretty darn good as well. But can you redeem that theory as a scholarly right approach to the work, even as it's being kind of used as a sham to tear down the work?
Yeah, it's a great point. So let me start here. Critical race theory has been and continues to be presented as a boogeyman. It is intended to scare people. Critical race theory is not a scary theory. Critical race theory is about examining the intersection of race and ethnicity and power in the United States of America and its impact in various sectors, right? So critical race theory is not taught in a K-12 classroom. It's not. Most classroom teachers who leave our educator preparation programs are not taught critical race theory. Now, if you earn a master's degree or a PhD, you may likely learn about critical race theory in our educator preparation programs. And if you have a student who comes through a traditional educator preparation program, I did teach my undergraduates about critical race theory. It's from the vantage point of thinking about how you engage students in the classroom. And what I mean by that is thinking about students who tend to be disenfranchised and marginalized in the learning experience. So how can I make certain that the content that I'm teaching, so if I'm teaching All Quiet on the Western Front, And I know that students may not have interest or engagement in this topic. How do I consider the audience and the intersection between who the audience is with the content that I'm teaching so I engage them in the lesson? I'm not teaching them about critical race theory. I'm looking at my classroom through a framework to figure out how to engage the audience in the content. That's where we get into critical race theory, but it's not a topic that's taught in the classroom. Now, what may be taught in the classroom, quite honestly, is racism. What may be taught in the classroom, quite honestly, is the impact of racism. That's not critical race theory. That's teaching about racism. If you're teaching about history and slavery, things of that nature, that's not teaching critical race theory. That's teaching history. That's what teachers should teach, history, in a way that's not whitewashed. It's teaching history. It's presenting facts. That's not critical race theory. So I think it's important that we understand what critical race theory is and what it is not. And then we can speak to what it appears or how it appears in the classroom. What I would say to you also with respect to critical race theory, it's no different from any other theoretical framework that we teach in our ed prep programs. Nobody ever questions constructivism. Nobody questions behaviorism. Nobody questions the zone of proximal development. These are all theoretical frameworks that I've heard nobody talk about. Critical race theory is but one of those frameworks. It's a classroom teacher looking at a classroom, figuring out how to engage learners using that theoretical framework to determine a course of action within the classroom. You're not teaching in the classroom Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence. You're not teaching in the classroom constructivism. You're not teaching in the classroom behaviorism. No classroom teacher I know goes into a classroom and teaches the theory. The theory guides the planning, the assessment, the evaluation, and the continuous improvement. It's boogeyman approach. That's what this is. So the next time someone says to you, critical race theory is, say to them, well, what about constructivism? What about behaviorism? What about, if you're going to pull out one theory, pull them all out. Otherwise, I don't want to hear it. My apologies if I got on the soapbox.
Oh,
No,
that's
we like it on the
Thank you.
soapbox. And I
Yes,
will add
bring it.
that it is a pleasure and a privilege to have not just an educational administrator, not just an advocate for education, but a really fine educator to help clarify and explain and bring us all along. So thank you, Dr. Graham, for again, generously giving your time, your expertise, such an informative and challenging presentation. It will be available as a recording for those who wish to look back and refresh your memory, think more, be challenged again. I'm going to ask our fellow planning team member, Spence O'Neill, to say a word about next month.
Hi, well, we hope you can join us next month on May 3rd. Our focus will be on the upcoming primary elections for state and local offices. And we'll hear from partners with Every Child NC and others about how to best determine which candidates are truly interested in adequately funding and supporting equitable public education. So again, that's Tuesday, May 3rd at noon.
I wish I had this cartoon to show you all. I have to describe a cartoon. A colleague of mine recently showed me a cartoon in 3 frames. The first frame is a crowd in front of a speaker who shouts, "Who wants change?" And everyone says they do. They wave in response. The second frame is, "Who wants to change?" And no one actually waves their hands, but they're still all there. "Who wants to lead change?" And the crowd is gone, except for folks like Dr. Graham, who are still around, taking the risks of leading change. And we really thank you for your time today and your work on behalf of North Carolina. Thanks very much.
Thank you all very much.
We hope to see you next month. Thanks for being with us today. Thanks very much, Dr. Graham.
Thank you all. I appreciate the invitation. Anytime, I'm willing to come back. I enjoy engaging you all. So please, anything I can do, let me know.
Thanks.
All
We
right.
wish you a healthy set of weeks
Thank
and
you.
months ahead.
I
We
appreciate it.
really pray for good health.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you. Diane,
Mhm.
can you capture the chat like you did before? Thank you. And I don't mind going through and editing if you'll just send it to me. Okay. I took the others out. I hope that's okay.